As our planet gets hotter, we need to find better ways of adapting to extreme weather. The latest science shows that nature can provide the best defences against climate change impacts, including heat waves, drought and rising sea levels. Here's how. As the ice caps melt, sea levels are rising. Many major cities are already threatened by flooding and erosion. Now, we can try to fight this with expensive projects like building seawalls, but there's often a more holistic and cheaper solution: nature. For example, planting mangrove forests defends against coastal flooding and storm surges. Mangroves weaken the strength of the waves, which stops the shoreline from crumbling into the sea. Coral reefs also provide flood defences by breaking big waves and absorbing their energy before they hit the shore. It's predicted there will be more and more heat waves in the years to come. In fact, it's already happening. But we have a major problem in the way we try to keep cool. Our air conditioning systems use tons of fossil fuels, which only makes the problem worse. While our houses stay cool, the planet doesn't. But again, nature has an answer. Bringing nature into cities can help keep the temperature down. Trees release water through their leaves, just like we cool down by sweating. And urban lakes and rivers also help keep temperatures low. And by using nature, we get extra benefits. Green spaces filter toxic air pollution. They can be used for recreation and they're beautiful. Drought is a major impact of climate change, and scientists predict it will become even more common in the years to come. This is a major problem, especially in poorer parts of the world where many people still rely on rain for farming. But trees and wetlands act like sponges, absorbing water and recharging groundwater supplies. So when we cut down trees, droughts get worse because rain flushes straight through the soil instead of being stored for times of need. But when we keep our forests, lakes and rivers healthy, then we're also protecting our water supplies. Coastal erosion, heat waves and drought are just some of the climate impacts that can be tackled using nature. This nature-based approach is called ecosystem-based adaptation, restoring and protecting ecosystems to help people adapt to climate change. But the really amazing thing about ecosystem-based adaptation is that it protects both people and planet. When we use nature to defend ourselves from climate change, we also create space for plants and animals to flourish. A lot of environmental news can be pretty bleak, from starving polar bears to melting ice caps and disappearing forests. It can be hard not to focus on what's going wrong. But ecosystem-based adaptation is about focusing on what we gain, not on what we lose. Today, there's no need to choose between nature or people. Now, it's nature for people.
Okay, so any comments on that whilst I share my other screen now? And you're seeing the screen? Everybody okay now?
Yes, we can see.
All right, thanks. So today our focus is on natural resource valuation for EbA, and it's really how do we apply the techniques of natural resource valuation to ecosystem-based adaptation. What sort of, we spoke a little about it last week in terms of the kinds of evidence that governments or what we can say to policymakers about protecting ecosystems. What would drive the great protection of our ecosystems in terms, for example, of channeling more resources to agencies that are responsible for ecosystems. So that's our focus today in module 3. It's really a crash course in NRV because this can be a course in itself. as some of you are well aware. Just a recap of module 2. So last week we got into the very high level EbA, just looking at some of the key terms associated with EbA, starting with urban areas through to peri-urban areas, introducing some of the forms of or the types of EbAs, looking at the advantages of EbA to urban and peri-urban planning, and some of the options that are available. I know that there were I think topic 8, what does effective EbA actually look like? We did not go into that, but I will actually leave that for next week when we go into really and truly the different EbA designs, how you do it, the applicability, as well as we would discuss NAPs, National Adaptation Plans, and the role of EbA in NAPs, as well as mainstreaming of EbAs into various processes and policies. So again, I'll pause for a moment just to ask if there are any comments or questions on module 2 that you would like us to address, or it would be okay to leave it to module 4. I believe next week we will also have a guest lecturer who would speak to us for maybe about 45 to 45 minutes. And I'm gonna ask Anna. Anna, would you like to just provide a little paragraph on the guest lecturer? Anna?
Hi, everyone. Morning. So the guest lecturer will be Tanya Chambers, and she is currently reviewing the policies and strategies surrounding EbA. So she'll be able to give you, and I think she's probably met with many of you, especially the government agencies already, to get feedback on the current policies and what could potentially be included in the future. So she will spend some time on that. And I think it'll be good discourse as well for what we're doing here.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so getting straight into topic 3, module 3, sorry, which is on NRV. So under this module, there are 5 topics that we're going to be looking at. 5 topics that we're going to be looking at. The importance of valuing ecosystems. Why should we value ecosystems? And why, for example, why were ecosystems not valued? I mean, why, and how do we do that? Linking NRVs and EbAs, looking at some of the environmental valuation methods, undertaking what is referred to even begin to value an ecosystem. One of the things that you are required to do is to undertake what is referred to as a total economic value of that ecosystem. How many persons have actually done a total economic value of an ecosystem? Because then helps you to determine the methodology or the method that you would use to value each component of the ecosystem. So really a TEV is a sort of semi-technical term that really looks at the attributes of ecosystems and try to put those attributes into categories. And then following that, it then provides a basis upon which you could apply different tools to add values or to determine the values of the services that the ecosystems provide. And that's the base. And then following that, we look at environmental valuation methods. So now that you have done this total economic value, what are the environmental valuation methods that you can use? So if you wanted to value, for example, the service of pollination, how is there a natural resource valuation technique that can do that? And the answer is actually yes. You know, if you want to value the ability of coral reefs to prevent storm surge, is there a way that we can do that? The answer again is yes. Would it be the same valuation method as the value of pollination? No, it's not. It's a totally different method. So you have various methods. Some organizations, for example, when we have, I think NEPA, you would have done NRVs for things like fish kills. So if there is a fish kill, what is the value of the resources lost? Or if there is a pollution in a river, for example, what is the cost to society of that pollution? How do we value the ecosystem? What has been lost as a result of that pollution incident? So we'll go into some of those today. Any comments, questions, or I can move on? I may not be fully seeing the chat. Okay, I don't think there is anything in there. So you all are very quiet this morning, so you need to somebody needs to get you going. So today we're going to understand the linkages between EbA and NRV, define ecosystem values, actually undertake a TEV, why it's important to place economic values on ecosystems. I think we all agree that we should know the various tools and be able to undertake a TEV of a named ecosystem or any ecosystem, because it's really easy. So valuing ecosystems. How does government allocate expenditures? And let's start at, we have several agencies here that interact with natural resources. I think we have NEPA, we have forestry, we have the ministry, we have climate change division, we have several entities in front of us. We have UDC, I believe. How does government justify and decide how to allocate public spending on conservation, preservation, or restoration initiatives? How do we sit on several committees, right? And we have several projects that are being implemented across government. Let's not think about environmental projects, but let's think about housing, let's think about agriculture. We may have several, commerce projects, etc. But we may also want to, we have tourism projects. How do we compare the benefits of, say, different projects or programs in comparison with the losses that may be accrued as a result of these development projects? So losses, environmental losses, ecosystem losses. Do these developments or projects justify the loss to the ecosystem or the ecosystem function? Is there a way that we could show, if let's say we were to keep a particular ecosystem intact, would that be better than a particular developmental project? And let me put straight up, I'm not here to tell anybody to hug a tree and that kind of thing, because I'm not that. I'm an environmental economist. How do we? It's really looking at the value of ecosystems, the values that they provide over time, and if we undertake activities that allow the ecosystems to lose their integrity and be unable to carry out their functions sufficiently, what is the cost to society? And would this particular project or program be able to make changes or incorporate man-made structures that would carry out the same function as the ecosystems, and what would be the cost? So then how do we actually, what is the approach to actually prioritizing conservation projects? How do we prioritize those, taking into account other developmental initiatives, issues, etc.? And how do we maximize the environmental benefit per dollar that we spend? So anybody wants to sort of begin a sort of discussion on this? The first one, I think, may be the easiest. How do we justify allocating expenditure on conservation, preservation, or restoration initiatives? Anyone? Are you all here? Anyone with me?
Yes, we are. I am.
So how is spending allocated? Do we consider when we are preparing our budgets, do we consider the value of these ecosystems, for example, or the ecosystem value that is lost, and therefore if we spend X amount of dollars in conservation, this is what would be gained, and this is what would be the value society gains? Anybody? I will move on, and then we'll come back to it at some point.
I will speak to the first one. Miss?
Go ahead.
Chinar?
Yeah, Chinar. Yeah, so I do believe some level of consideration is placed on, you know, really the value of our ecosystem services, and that in that regard now the amount of money that is allocated to a particular, for example, conservation, you know, that will really influence the amount of money. For example, like our mangrove community, along the stretch of the Palisades going towards Port Royal, you know, some level of valuation would be done to say, if these mangroves weren't there, you know, this entire road, you know, probably would have eroded away, right? So I think the government take in consideration, you know, the money that, you know, like the mangrove community will save them in terms of, you know, the national work agents would be have to spend, you know, to really fix road, making new roads, or come up with, you know, some form of, you know, infrastructure that will, that the mangrove is naturally doing for us, to really allowing them to save money. So in terms, I don't think we are, the natural ecosystem is properly compensated in terms of, you know, the value that it add to our environment, you know, but I do believe that some level of consideration is placed, and some money is allocated based upon an estimate in, you know, the natural resource valuation of, you know, a particular, you know, community like the mangrove community.
Have we done any valuation of any particular ecosystems? Anyone aware of specific valuations done to say, well, this is the value of this particular mangrove, this is the economic value of the cockpit country, this is the value of the water it provides, this is the value of XYZ. Have we done valuations? Are you aware of any valuations that have been done on our ecosystem? Anybody? Anybody from NEPA? Evelyn, you wanted to say something as well? Evelyn?
Good morning, everybody. Not in response to the last question you asked, but just in terms of thinking that the concept of value, while some of us might seem it to be objective, it is quite subjective, particularly when we think of things like aesthetic values. There are some values that might not be able to be quantified. So I think it is best that we identify all the values, be they objective or subjective, and then depending on our audience at a given time, we might highlight what we think might be specific to them. Because at the end of the day, it for those of us who are passionate about our environment, our negotiation has to do with what seems valuable to our audience at the time of negotiation. So it's very important for us to look at a broad concept of what is valuable to different persons. For example, as I mentioned, aesthetic value. Speaking again of the Palisades protected area, when we think in terms of, not just in terms of the roads, because if you notice, to offset the problem caused by Hurricane Ivan, they did not plant mangroves. They threw some big boulders. So an individual might say, I prefer to put the boulders and let the mangroves take care of themselves. But the aesthetic values, when you now start thinking in terms of it as a habitat for fish, for birds, as bird sanctuary, things like that, then the bird watchers might seem it more valuable. Somebody else might say, what's the purpose of it being a habitat for spawning fish? Let us find somewhere else. So it's a matter of highlighting the wide variety of values that it provides to the different groups and then using them as is appropriate to advance our cause.
Okay, so the idea is, I mean, when we're valuing ecosystems, it's really determining all the values. What are all of the different values? And some of the values that we may not often consider upfront in terms of an economic value, a policymaker thinking of an economic value, actually do provide significant value to society. So if we think of that same mangrove, you speak about bird watching and a nursery for fish, and that may not have much appetite for your policymakers. But if you can show your policymaker the impact of that mangrove as it relates to reducing inland flooding, or the impact of that mangrove as it relates to storm surge, if we were to be able to look at those values and say, if you were to reduce the mangrove by this amount, this is the impact to society of, say, a 1 in 5 rainfall event, which is more, which would cost us more than the proceeds we will get from this particular development, right? Because I'm seeing the hand. For me, for example, you know, the environment, for many people, the environment is like a color, right? So if we look on the screen, we see that beautiful purple color. That's how I see it. So for those people who hug the trees and very passionate about the environment, it is almost like a hobby. So it's something you like, but oftentimes for the rest of society, it is about saying to them, this is the value to you, or this is the value to society. And if you get rid of this, this is what would be lost in dollar terms. And this is what gets people to begin thinking, right? So for me, I prefer to look at the environment in terms of the benefits that can be derived, particularly from the services that are particularly important, especially since we now know, or we are more favored the fact that an intact environment does contribute to a better economic bottom line in terms of your own GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. But for many years, it was seen as just having a carrier space where we could utilize the environment for whatever we wanted and not necessarily think about the services that we provide. So I see, Ashley, your hand is up.
Right. I believe back in 2019, the TNC and with the help of the World Bank had done a study on flood protection benefits and the cost of restorations for mangroves in Jamaica. And in that report, they gave a synopsis of the areas that do have mangrove cover, the areas where it has been lost, and the benefit that a stand of mangrove would have in terms of a dollar value. And I believe also in that report, they compared it with hard infrastructure. What if you were to remove the mangrove and had to replace it with hard infrastructure, how much it would cost? If memory serves me right, I believe that they looked at the Kingston Harbor area. And if that area was to be rid of mangroves and they were to now decide to put in hard infrastructure, you're looking at, I think it's more than 10 million per kilometer to put in hard infrastructure. So there are reports out there. I think there needs to be more. So yes, you have the aesthetic value, but there are reports out there that have that dollar value. And when you present a dollar value, I think that's more impactful.
Right. Thank you for that, Ashley. Yes. Actually, one of my colleagues led that thing, which is someone from the World Bank called Juliano. However, Roseanne, who's actually on the course, I don't see her as yet. I believe she was part of that study along with our Peter, because they did work as well with UE. So if Roseanne comes in today, I would probably ask her to speak briefly on it as well. That's Roseanne Smith from UE. Michaela, your hand is up. And I'm seeing some things in the chat. I'll refer to them shortly. Michaela?
Good morning, everyone. Aside from mangroves, I know of a study that was published by Mr. Edwards, Dr. Edwards, regarding the value of the cockpit country. Peter Edwards, and the value that was approximated was 2.6 billion per annum for the cockpit country. And he also estimated the value of carbon sequestration for 896 million per annum. That's in Jamaican dollars.
Okay. So yes, so we had some valuation studies on cockpit country and the returns of keeping the cockpit country intact. In his study, did he look, for example, or did he include, because he didn't have to look, the value of mining in the cockpit country? Did he also look at what would be lost, the cost to society, or in terms of what would be lost if we mined in the cockpit country? I would imagine he would have done that. Michaela?
Sorry, yes, sorry. Yes, he did. I'm going through the report.
All right. If you find it, you come back and we can have a discussion as we go along.
Okay.
Seeing here where Ashley is saying mangrove replanting has proven to be ineffective challenges. There is now a push to preserve existing mangroves. So, and then some mangroves were planted at the entrance of the Palisados by the Port Royal Marine Lab. Okay, so the idea of coming from Ashley is to determine how much, I think part of it as well, is to determine how much of an ecosystem you can lose without the integrity of the ecosystem being significantly impacted, that it's not able to carry out its functions. And I think that is key to the whole NRV debate. So if we think of the natural environment, this really presents a recap of some of what we discussed before: the regulatory functions, the carry out, the production. The regulatory functions are not so easy to replace, and for many years, we looked at the environment for more the carrier functions, the space to cultivate, the space for human settlement, this as a space for infrastructure, as a space to meet the needs of the physical needs of the society without reflecting on how these ecosystems also met other needs of society. And we focused a lot on the production function, so oxygen, water, food, but not so much on the linkages amongst these different functions, because as we lose forests and watersheds, I believe we also lose genetic resources and the importance of genetic resources. The idea of medicinal resources, oftentimes when we speak of medicinal resources coming from the environment, people really just focus or think that you're talking about, I remember you having a discussion with, in a cabinet meeting on the environment. And the notion was, is Liz talking about fever grass? And then we went into this whole discussion that, you know, the medication that we consume on a day-to-day basis, that, you know, that we purchase from the pharmacy, many of those actually contain, or they come from, the idea of the medication comes from plants and animals. Eventually, you can take the properties of the plant and create something in a lab. So in the case of aspirin, for example, originally, it came from the bark of the willow tree, right? And the Native American Indians would boil it for pain and fever. But you can go into a lab with the bark of this willow tree and determine the properties and create this thing solely as a synthetic product. But we know that there are many medications now that really do include the actual plant or animal. So like the rosy periwinkle, which we're very familiar with, is actually a good child leukemia drug. It's used in the formulation of a child leukemia drug. So just getting society and policymakers to better understand is also key to how they value natural resources, and also how they make decisions around allocating resources. Because if you really don't understand it, you will not understand how to allocate it. I see a comment here from Ashley again. What needs to be considered as well is the success rate of compromise agreed on in construction, such as transplanting coral reefs for seaside developments or replanting of trees for development in forested areas. You want to elaborate on that, Ashley?
So sometimes the agreement that is struck between the government and these parties is that there's to be some form of compensation. So I'll use the farmers' pair, for example. There would be coral reefs that could be destroyed in that construction. So the arrangement that was agreed on was to have those corals transplanted to another area. Okay, the company has done that, but what is the success rate of that transfer? Are those corals still alive? Are they still serving the function that they were serving at the original location? Or you may have an instance where they say if you clear an area to do construction, you have to replant those trees somewhere else. Okay, you've replanted the trees, but have those trees lived on to maturity? And are really replacing the ecosystem that you cleared for development.
In the case of Falmouth, has that happened?
I'm not sure that I'm not aware of monitoring and evaluation that happened afterwards. I do know that with coral reefs, marine biology is my original background. Once you touch them, they die. So I'm not sure how successful that was. But that's important to have M&E monitoring and evaluation as a part of these arrangements to see if the arrangement that is struck is it actually beneficial? Are you transporting that ecosystem service to another place successfully?
And the question now becomes, to the place where you undertook the development, what is happening in and around that particular place? Do you have increased flooding in Falmouth, for example? I do recall at some point there was this notion of increased flooding in Falmouth, but I can't remember if it had to do with the with that particular development. I don't know if others can recall.
Well, Falmouth is where the area that the pier is situated in, I believe, is below sea level. So Falmouth already had an issue. And then you've now increased hard infrastructure. So when it rains, you've added to the problem.
Okay. So the question is, land is a finite resource. Can we always be replanting or relocating ecosystems? Adrian, you want to elaborate on that point?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of it in this way. Let's say, for example, we wanted to do development in the Blue and Jonker Mountains, right? And let's say it's 1,000 hectares. Now, if we continue to remove more forests like Blue Mountains, and let's say Jamaica is 100,000 hectares, every time we want to develop, we're going to relocate another 1,000, another 1,000. After a while, we won't have anywhere to relocate these forests to. And then you also have to think about it. When we're relocating these forests, what's actually in the space that we're in quote relocating these places to? I'm quite sure there is another ecosystem in that particular location that we will be quote unquote relocating these forests or these coral reefs to. And so are we disturbing another ecosystem to so-called replace the one that we are trying to replace? So I'm thinking, like, for example, if we say that we're relocating the Blue and Jonker Mountain forest for development to where Elshire limestone forest is, we're eliminating another ecosystem so that we can claim that we're doing an environmental good, if you understand what I'm saying.
But would the other thing is, would the actual elements that you're taking to this other system be appropriate there? If you're taking forests from Blue Mountain, is it the same soil type? Is it the same living conditions, etc.? I mean, is it?
Is it the same composition of species?
Exactly. Would you have a dominant species in the Blue Mountain that will wipe out some species on the flat area? I don't know. I mean, it obviously has to have a range of considerations. A number of things ought to be considered in making these decisions. So the question is, can the functions of the natural environment be given economic values? I think we're all agreeing that they can. The question is, how? You know, how do you go about doing the value? We've seen studies, did they go about determining these values? And of course, I've put in here, just as an example, the case of pollination. It is a regulatory function of the natural environment. Can we put a value on pollination? What is the value? Have we been able to do things like valuing pollination in Jamaica? What is the value? What is the value of pollination to food security? For example. So I have an example here where this is in the US, where bee colonies cost about $185 to rent during, I think it's $1 million to rent during the crops, $185 to rent during the crop season. In 2010, a beekeeper lost 200 colonies due to pesticides. This resulted in an estimated $5 million loss to the US economy due to crop loss. There's also an example of bees. I think this is the example of the Wine Valley in California, where the bees were lost to pesticides. The loss to the economy wasn't just the grapes but it was also the loss to the wine industry. So you begin to see very quickly the value of the bee, because they also had the issue of introducing bees from South America, similar bees, which really didn't work because they just quickly died out, not because of pesticide, but because of the new conditions. And it was felt that the bees they were introducing were similar to the bees in California, et cetera, but they really were not. So really, in a nutshell, when we speak about natural resource NRV, natural resource valuation, what we're looking at is a specific approach on how much ought to be invested in ecosystems to enhance their resilience and to enhance the benefits to society. This was a flood event in Portland in 1998, actually. What do you think would have contributed to this? Chinar, your hand is up. Chinar?
Yes, I just have a question in terms of the valuation. Similar to like what they do for the carbon, like the carbon stock, like where they have the allometric equations. In terms of to really value like a particular area, value a particular resource, getting a feedback though. All right, so in terms of like for us to really value a particular, let's say for example, the cockpit country, right? Couldn't we use some form of, is there any allometric equation, you know, that we could just really use, or, you know, some form of mathematical,
yeah, it's highly mathematical because it's economics, right? So yes, to come down to the actual value is highly mathematical, and it's a number of equations. What we're going to be doing today is really, really simple, right? So really, what is the value, what it costs, what is lost, etc., etc. All right.
Yeah. But what I get what you're saying, you know, is like the actual value in terms of, you know, what would happen if, you know, this ecosystem would be absent.
No, but it's what is the value of the ecosystem as is, not if it's absent. You could also determine if it's absent as well, but what is the value of the intact ecosystem? What values, what is the monetary value of that system now? What is the monetary value of the cockpit country as it exists? What are the goods and services that we get from that system? Understand?
Not so clear, but I think I will get it as we go along, all right?
Okay, I hope so. But if not, raise your hand again. All right?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me 1 second, please? Just 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm back with you. Okay, so while we're valuing natural resources, what we want to get is a means of measuring and comparing the various benefits of environmental resources and their ecosystems, because what that can do is allow us to better manage these resources and also better manage, and more importantly, manage the use of these resources, right? So natural resource valuation really incorporates a number of techniques that economists use to assess the economic value of the marketed goods that comes from these ecosystems, as well as the non-marketed goods or services that come from these ecosystems. So what it does is that from the various goods and services, we're able to compare the various benefits that ecosystems provide. So it's not just about saying this is what the ecosystem does, it's about saying to a policymaker, these are the benefits, this is the economic value of this resource. If we were to lose this resource, this is what we would lose on an annual basis. If we were to use this resource, let's go back to the cockpit country. If we were to use this resource for mining, this is what the market value of mining would be for the next 25 years based on the amount of bauxite in cockpit country. This, however, is what would be lost. So for example, it is expected to affect the water supply to, say, the Western region. It may affect farming, it may contribute to reducing rainfall, etc. So how do we value those things? And what is the value of that against the value that the bauxite would have? And that then helps you to make a decision. You getting it a little closer now, Chino? You're understanding it a little better?
Yes, yes, I get where you're going. Yes.
You're getting where we're going, you don't get it.
Yes.
Okay, so it's actually a decision aiding tool to support decision-making or policies and decision-making processes around development that is utilizing the natural resource base and ecosystems, or not utilizing it, but maybe getting rid of it, using land space that, you're losing certain biodiversity. Okay, so what is the value of that loss? What is the value of the biodiversity here to the farming here, to agriculture? How is it going to affect the loss of this ecosystem or the partial loss of this ecosystem? How is it going to affect GDP growth? What is the link between that and natural disasters? So if we were to use our forests as, look at it for the lumber, there is an easy value to get. What is the value of selling that lumber? But when we do that, what is the cost? What is the cost of a rainfall event? What is expected to happen? And sometimes it's easy to determine those costs. We could determine very simply the value of the lost forests in places like Kintyre and stuff, because they're impacted a lot by flooding, right? Or we have a little rain and you have these landslides. We could just look at the budget of NWA, for example. What does it cost NWA each year to clean up landslides or to clean up communities? What are these $1 million costs? But what would then be the cost of replanting that forest? What will we gain as a result of that? So could we give those resources or a portion of those resources, say to forestry department, to replant or to maintain the forest better, as opposed to having to give those resources to National Works Agency for cleanup activities? So what does economic valuation really just assesses a resource in terms of its value to humans? All right, I'm seeing stuff in the chat. Land is a finite resource. Can we always be replanting? Samantha Grant, it wouldn't be the same. The Blue and John Crow. Oh, so this is from before. Aisha, NRVs are also relevant in the assessment of proposed developments and age in the decision-making in the case of development applications submitted for the permits and license. So this is another way in which it could be used. Should we go ahead with this development? What would be lost if we from an ecosystem's perspective, what would be lost, what values to society would be lost in terms of services from that ecosystem, and would we as a society be willing to pay to replace the value that is the ecosystem that is lost? So is there a way to replace that ecosystem and provide the same benefits? And most cases, it is not. I don't know if Aisha, you want to elaborate in any way on how, for example, these NRVs have been used. Have they allowed you to make different decisions, or did the development go ahead anyway?
All right, so I know that for one particular case, an NRV was requested in terms of the Princess Hotel. And what that has done is to guide the mitigation measures that would become applicable. And as an agency, we are also now applying the concept of environmental performance bonds. And essentially what the bond does is almost like an insurance to ensure that the permittees, the licensees, comply with the conditions of their approval. If they do not, if they breach, then the agency is able to draw down on that particular bond and use the funds to effect any restoration activities, etc. So the NRVs become very important in the calculation of what the environmental performance bond should be. So we're also using that from that perspective as well. That's it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Aisha. Yes, because we know NEPA has been using the tool for various purposes. So what we need to find out first and foremost is what is the actual sum value, which is referred to as the total economic value of a resource. And this, of course, is made up of different types of values. When we think of each resource, so first and foremost, we need to look at our ecosystem. So this is the case of wetlands. So we all know what a wetland does. If we look at our wetland, this sort of information that you are very familiar with becomes part of what the total economic value looks like. So first and foremost, in determining the value of ecosystems, we come up with this notion of a total economic value of the ecosystem. In doing so, to be able to do that, we need to determine what the ecosystem does. And what are the values that are simple values? If the ecosystem provides fish, then we could easily determine the value of the fish from the ecosystem by looking at, for example, the amount of fishermen in that particular space, the amount of fish landings per year, the price of fish, and we say, okay, the value of the fish, the value of fish that comes out of the ecosystem is this. But it's a little harder to look at filtering of pollutants, but we need to place that and determine how are we going to put an economic value on that? What is the technique we can use? And then following on the technique, of course, you get into your complex economic equations to then come up with this particular value. All right. So all of these, if we look at filtering of pollutants, forestalling of wave actions, protection of spawning and feeding grounds for fish and shellfish, controlling of inland flooding, provision of habitat, all of these we could put an economic value on. All right. So it's just a series of techniques that we use to assess the economic value of market and non-market goods. So if we think of that particular wetland, what would be examples of marketed and non-marketed goods within that ecosystem? Or if we think of cockpit country, what are examples of marketed and non-marketed goods? Anybody?
It would be like market goods would be like the timber that you would get from the forest, and the non-market goods would be like the air quality that it regulates, and also the fact that it is a carbon storage, natural carbon sequester, and so forth.
What about the watershed function? Can we put a value on that?
Yes, that as well.
Okay, so we're saying that from a very broad perspective, we haven't gone into total economic value, we haven't done any of that, but we're saying we're looking at these techniques, we want to value these ecosystems, we're looking at comparing the various benefits of environmental resources and ecosystems. We're using it as it can be used effectively as a decision aiding tool to allow us to better preserve our ecosystems, to better use and manage natural resources. Of course, the bottom line is, what is the bottom line in terms of these resources? What is the dollar value? So we're saying it can play a role in decision making, but it can also play a role in the case of compensation. Anyone wants to hazard how that can be done? Or what is that about? If, for example, you have a pollution incident and you're requiring a company to pay for that pollution incident, would you be able to put a value on what is lost as a result of that incident? And be able to compensate, whether it's the fishers. I think NEPA has done this before, if I'm not mistaken. Can I call on you, Aisha, to respond?
Okay, so in terms of compensation, I don't want to say specifically which particular case.
No, don't be specific, just.
Right, so we had a particular case where the performance bond that was calculated actually had a compensation component. And so we would have looked at the value of the fisheries and included this value in the calculation of the performance bond. And from this, we were able to derive, based on the number of fishers, etc., what would be some sort of compensation for each fisher. And so from the environmental performance bond, we were able to provide that compensation value. So each person.
Because what had happened to the ecosystem?
Right, ecosystem had been, there was a breach of the instrument, and thus there was damage to the ecosystem. By virtue of there being damage to the ecosystem, it means that they would have been directly impacted by that damage, which would have resulted in a reduction in the fishes being available for their particular livelihood. And so those are the types of things that we, pardon me?
Go ahead, Aisha. Go ahead.
Right, and so those are the types of things that we would consider in the calculation of the performance bond. What I can say at this point in time is that as an agency, we're looking more into the separating the compensation component and dealing with that as a grievance mechanism versus having it incorporated within the environmental performance bond itself. So we have to look at different techniques in terms of our application.
And then in terms of restoration, I just wanted to ask you another question related to that, because in terms of compensation, would compensation also have taken into account the restoration of the ecosystem, or is it that it was totally lost? And
so the bond itself in its totality looked at that as well. So the compensation factor was a part of the calculation of the performance bond. So we looked at the restoration component based on the other values attributed to the ecosystem services of the various resources. And so all of that was taken into consideration in the calculation of the performance bond. So the restoration component was separated from the compensation component as it pertains.
That's what I wanted you to clarify, because compensation for how long, for example, compensation till restoration, and when they can just get back on track with their livelihoods, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. So we would have looked at it based on a
so it's not compensation for the rest of their lives. I mean, you could have that too, you know.
So we would have looked at the time that they were impacted, and then it is based on that calculation that that their value would have been calculated, and that would have determined how much they were actually compensated at.
Right, how much they were in, the length of time impacted, and then the length of time to restore to normalcy. Right. Yeah. Okay. So just a brief discussion here. What do you think are some of the uses to decision makers of NRV, and how do you think NRV and EbA are related? I think Aisha has gone into the NRV already and strengthening existing EIA processes.